Hi, this is Macrophage, and Gavin Ortlund has put out a second video, some of which appears to respond to some points I made in my first video. So I'm going to do this one last time. I'm convinced that Gavin Ortlund doesn't want to hear from young Earth creationists, and I don't think he's open to dialogue with us and never was. He pretty much said so. He said this in this second video, quote, "This is not directed toward well-studied young Earth creationists. There, we just have disagreements," end quote. It appears Ortlund is not interested in discussing those disagreements. Rather, he appears interested in speaking only to, I guess, non-well-studied young Earth creationists. So he manages to say in one sentence, "I'm not going to talk to smart people on the other side," and insult his audience at the same time. So this is not going to be a fruitful dialogue in the future, obviously, because he's not open to the same kind of humility that he demands of young Earthers. So I'm going to mention a few issues that came up in this video, and then I'm going to go back and revisit a couple of the things from the first video that Ortlund kind of semi-responds to, and then I'm not going to engage with his work anymore. Ortlund mentions Judges 4 and 5 as an interesting example of ancient Hebrew poetry. Judges 5 is a song written by Deborah about the events that are related in the narrative of Judges 4. So we have a narrative in ancient Hebrew and a poem in ancient Hebrew about the same thing. That is really interesting, and young Earth creationists have noticed this before, as most of the questions and issues Gavin brings up have been noticed before and answered before, but it's clear Ortlund is not interested in those answers. He would rather just ask the questions and not engage with answers from the other side. So an expert in ancient Hebrew named Stephen Boyd used Judges 4 and Judges 5, along with a number of other ancient Hebrew texts, from the Bible, to analyze the number of preterite verbs in these texts. And a preterite verb just means an action verb that is past tense, sort of. So it's something that happened in the past, and it's a grammatical way of distinguishing between a narrative and a poem. And so narratives tend to have way more preterite verbs than poems. And he did a statistical study of these texts to show that. And then he applied this test to Genesis 1 and found that it was in fact a narrative, not a poem. Link to that paper in the description. At one point, Ortlund rehashes what amounts to the Old Earth interpretation of the conflict thesis, which is a revisionist history that was pushed by atheists and evolutionists in the late 19th century because they were mad at Christians for opposing Darwinian evolution. And they reinvented the history of especially the Copernican revolution, which was 2 centuries prior to that. And this revisionist history has been promoted by many Old Earth Christians for reasons completely unknown to me. It makes no sense for Old Earth Christians to do this because Old Earth Christians were against this at the time. The conflict thesis stuff was directed against Old Earthers and Young Earthers together. But Old Earthers have gone back to this and become convinced by this. And I've talked about this on my podcast when I addressed John Lennox's propagation of parts of the conflict thesis. So what is Ortlund's version of the conflict thesis? Ortlund's version of the conflict thesis is that geocentrism just exists. He knows not when or from whence it came, right? It's there. He doesn't look at where the geocentrism came from or what it is. And he says geocentrism just exists. And look, all these Christians were believing in geocentrism because they thought that the Bible said so. They thought that the Bible supported geocentrism, and that's why they were geocentrists. And then science came along, right, as though, geocentrism was not also science, but we'll get to that in a second. Science comes along and disproves this interpretation of the Bible. And so this shows that sometimes science is right and your interpretation of the Bible is wrong. And so you should be open to reinterpreting the Bible because science tells you so. Well, this ignores the features of the geocentric model at the time, which was called the Ptolemaic model, after, coincidentally, an astronomer named Ptolemy from the 2nd century AD. Notice that is 1,400 years before the Copernican revolution. This was a well-studied astronomical model. It was a scientific model of the solar system that was based on observation, astronomical observation, and certain assumptions about circular orbits, and in particular, an attempt to solve the problem of retrograde motion of some of the outer planets by introducing a feature of the Ptolemaic model called epicycles, as well as equants and other things like that. But it was a very sophisticated astronomical model. It was a scientific model of the solar system that had been in place for 1,400 years. Now, what happened? Well, people decided that the scientific model that they had learned in school was true, and therefore they needed to find in the Bible support for it. And that's what Calvin and Luther and some people in the Catholic Church did at the time of the Copernican revolution, and that's why they rejected Copernicus's model. So Ortlund shows some quotes from Calvin and Luther because he doesn't want to pick on the Catholic Church. Okay, but all Christians were targeted by the conflict thesis revisionist history. It wasn't just the Catholic Church that was targeted. So switching focus from the Catholic Church to Protestants does not absolve the conflict thesis of what it did, which was revise history and ignore important points like the fact that the Ptolemaic model was an astronomical model that was very accurate by the standards of the time, and it was a scientific model. And so when they went to the Bible, they saw through the lens, right? I don't need a lens. I have 4 eyes. They saw through the lens of the Ptolemaic model and saw it in the Bible where it didn't exist. This is exactly what old earthers do today. They just use a different lens. Okay? They're reinterpreting or interpreting the Bible according to a source of truth that they're getting from outside the Bible. And this is why I emphasized in the previous video that Augustine got his idea of instantaneous creation from outside the Bible. It's because Augustine's instantaneous creation idea was a lens through which he was interpreting the Bible. Geocentrism, or the Ptolemaic model, was a lens through which they were interpreting the Bible. Old earth claims are a lens through which you're interpreting the Bible. The only difference is it's a different lens. So it's no surprise that modern old earthers are simpatico with people like Augustine because they're doing the same thing, but with a different lens, okay? And this is why they make this mistake of assuming that Augustine speculated about an old earth or long days, because they see similarities between Augustine distorting the Bible through a lens and what they're doing. And so it's just a different lens, right? And so I enjoy pointing out the differences between the two lenses. And I'll do some of that towards the end of this video. Okay, so Ortlund says that Augustine, being a young earth creationist, is missing the point, right? Why? It's missing the point because Augustine was using a lens to interpret Scripture just like Ortlund is doing. It doesn't matter that he wasn't young earth, right? But Ortlund, in this video and the first video, continues to rely on scientific evidence to make his case while trying to pretend that scientific evidence is not influencing his reading of the Bible. You can't have it both ways. You can't appeal to scientific evidence in favor of your position and simultaneously claim that scientific evidence is not influencing my interpretation of the Bible. Now, Ortlund does say, quote, "This objection is valid in principle," unquote, meaning the objection that I just made, using scientific evidence to interpret the Bible. But he doesn't refute it. He appears to admit that's what he's doing. So I fail to see the relevance of all of this argumentation if you're just going to admit that you are interpreting the Bible through the lens of scientific evidence. He doesn't say that explicitly, but it appears to be what he's allowing. Because what he goes on to do after this is he starts talking about scientific evidence, and he does the same thing in the first video. He uses hand motions. He's like, "It's pressing down on me," you know. I have to take this into account because it's so strong. Okay? And then he goes through a number of things that he makes some claims that are unclear, but he says these are evidences of an old earth or something, which he doesn't really expound on in any way to get to an old earth conclusion. And at one point he says, I was just looking at this 20 minutes before I did this video. So I decided to take a look at one of the claims that he makes that we can demonstrate is not always true. He uses the example of tree rings or dendrochronology. Quote, "Suppose you chop down a tree and you see 30 tree rings. The natural conclusion would be the tree seems to be 30 years old." That kind of reasoning is what we face when we look everywhere in nature. End quote. The natural conclusion. Now, if you are a little bit trained in logic, you'll notice that there's some information missing from this argument. You don't just see 30 things and assume that means 30 years have passed. You don't just look at tree rings and think, oh, well, that's 30 years. There's additional information that you're using here, and Ortlund appears not to recognize that because he calls it a natural conclusion. It's not a natural conclusion. It's an inference, okay, from other evidence that he does not include in his argument. This is the main problem with old earthers and people like Ortlund is they do not recognize the lens through which they are interpreting evidence. Probably at some point in his education, Ortlund was told in science class that one ring in a tree means 1 year of growth for that tree. Therefore, it's a natural conclusion. No, it's not. It's a conclusion from observation and evidence. That's not a basic observation. Now, we happen to know today that it is not always the case that one tree ring represents 1 year of growth. In fact, we know now that sometimes in certain environmental conditions, which just happen to be the environmental conditions that some of these really old bristlecone pines live in, that they can grow up to 5 rings per year. And as a result, the mainstream people who were investigating this had to retract many of their old estimates for these bristlecone pines and many other trees. Link in the description, and that includes in the article there includes references to the mainstream literature on this topic. The very people who claimed these trees were way older than the flood, or in some cases even older than creation, have reduced their estimates for these tree ages because of this. Okay? That's what happens when you think this is a natural conclusion and forget to account for the information that you've been taught, and probably in Ortlund's case many years ago, things that may or may not be true. As a scientist, you have to keep in mind your assumptions at all times. And you have to know what those assumptions are based on. And if something comes along, some data that comes along to change that, you have to be ready to change your conclusions. But, Gavin Ortlund's a pastor, so he doesn't do that kind of thing normally. Quote, basically everywhere we look, it's like looking at those 30 tree rings in the tree. Agreed. Everywhere we look, it gives testimony to a longer history. No. It is like the tree rings in the sense that there are assumptions involved. It's not a testimony. Nature doesn't speak. Scientific evidence doesn't speak. It doesn't give testimony. Okay, you interpret it through a lens. All right, so at the end of all this, Ortlund says, quote, in his own day, Augustine would have had no reason to know how old the earth is exactly, any more than he would have had reason to know about Einsteinian physics or something like that, end quote. Ortlund assumes that the only way to tell the age of something is a scientific method. Augustine had a reason to believe that the earth was less than 6,000 years old. It was the Bible. Yes, he did have a reason. He stated the reason. I read the quote last time. He gave his reason. It was the Bible, less than 6,000 years old. Ortlund thinks that he has gotten around this by his juvenile argument that Augustine was separating the beginning of the world from the beginning of the human race. And so he takes these quotes, looks at them, and tries to get around them by saying, oh, Augustine was talking about the human race here, not the world. Except there's a problem. The name of chapter 10 in book 12, which we're going to spend a lot of time in book 12 of City of God, the name of chapter 10 under which one of these quotes occurs is, and I read it in the first video, of the falseness of the history which allots many thousand years to the world's past. Not the human race's past, the world's past. I'll give another quote towards the end, showing that Augustine identified the beginning with the human race. So why is Ortlund thinking that he's correct on this? It has to do with another quote that he takes from Augustine in chapter 16. Quote, I own that I do not know what ages passed before the human race was created. Okay, so that appears, taken out of context, that Augustine is talking about some ages that passed before human beings were created. And Ortlund just assumes that that means between the initial creation and the creation of the human race. So he draws the conclusion that Augustine thought that the initial instantaneous creation did not include the creation of the human race, and the human race was created later. At least this Augustine's belief was this. He doesn't read the context of this quote, and so he just ends the discussion and because he's reading Augustine through an old earth lens instead of the correct lens that Augustine used, he's misinterpreting Augustine here. So let's talk a little bit, before we explain the context of this, let's talk a little bit about the lens that Augustine was using, which was geocentrism. And this has to do with the reason why Augustine had a problem with the sun being created on day 4 versus light being created on day 1. And so at one point in the video, Ortlund asks us to draw a picture of what's going on in Genesis 1. Challenging us to think about what's really going on. And doesn't it raise questions? And I have to wonder whether Ortlund himself has actually done this. because if he did, he might have understood what's going on here, which he clearly does not. The reason why Augustine had a problem here is because he's a geocentrist. So I'll ask you a question, Gavin. What is the length of a day based on in geocentrism? In the geocentric model, what is happening that denotes the time period of a single day? Okay, the Earth is at the center, the sun is revolving around it, and we just know that the length of a day is the length it takes for the sun to come back to the same position in the sky one time, right? So if you're a geocentrist, the sun is going around the Earth, and every time it goes around the Earth once, that's the length of a day. So if you read in Genesis 1 that the sun isn't created until day 4, there's no basis for the length of a day until day 4, and yet the first 3 days of Genesis 1 are talking about evening and morning. That's the problem Augustine had. That's the lens he was looking through. It was the lens of geocentrism. Okay? And so he comes up with this explanation that's very strange, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it involves, he thinks that time isn't created until day 4, and this is important to understand what he means by this quote that Ortlund thinks is so definitive. Okay, if you're a heliocentrist, what is the length of a day? What is it based on? It's based on the rotation of the Earth. So the Earth performs a single rotation in space, and that's the length of a day. You don't need the sun to determine the length of a day if you're a heliocentrist. You only need a fixed light source in space somewhere away from the Earth. And guess what? The Earth is there in Genesis 1 verse 2. It's already there, and light is created on Genesis 1. So Augustine's argument that you can't have time until you have the physical basis of a day, I think is correct. It's just he was a geocentrist. So he thought the basis of the day was created on day 4, but that's not true. Light and the Earth are there on day 1, and that's the basis of the length of a day. The only extra assumption you have to make is that the Earth was rotating at roughly the same speed it does today. Okay, that's it. All right, you've got a day, you've got the physical basis of a day right from day 1 on heliocentrism. Okay, so that's the answer to that whole question. I've dealt with that before, but I didn't go through the full explanation in my response to Ortlund. It's in episode 4 of my podcast, though. So this is a common problem that old earthers have when they're trying to figure out what all this is about, because they don't understand how to look through different lenses. Okay, because they're unaware of their own lens, or at least they're not willing to question their own lens. Okay, Augustine had a different lens. That's why he had a problem here. Now, there was another Christian writer who had the same lens as Augustine, a geocentric lens, and he talked about this same issue. His name is Basil of Caesarea, and I'll link to that passage in the description. Basil talked about geocentrism explicitly. He talked about the sun going around the Earth, and how this is a problem because the sun wasn't created till day 4 and all this. But interestingly, Basil's solution is different than Augustine's. Basil chooses, instead of trusting his own lens, he chooses to trust the Bible. And he says, well, okay, the day wasn't in existence before day 4, but God foreknew the length of a day and what it would be on day 4. And so he supernaturally just made the first 3 days, 24 hours, the same length as the day it would be on day 4. God just made the first 3 days that length. Okay, that's Basil's solution. And because of this, Basil ends up being correct about his interpretation of the Bible, where Augustine turns out to be incorrect. And Basil's solution is what Christians ought to do when they don't understand something in the Bible. They need to trust what the Bible says. and not distort what it says by looking through a lens from somewhere else. Okay? Basil was right, Augustine was wrong. And now we have a completely different lens that people who treat the Bible the way Augustine did are looking through. They're looking through a different lens today. It's the same kind of procedure, but they're looking through a different lens. Rest assured, that lens is going to break and become useless eventually as well. And people who trusted the Bible are going to turn out to be right, just like Basil was. Okay, so what does this have to do with this quote from Augustine that Ortlund thinks is so definitive? Let's read the quote again. This is at the beginning of chapter 16 of book 12 of City of God. Quote, "I own that I do not know what ages passed before the human race was created." So it seems like, if you just read that, right, it seems like Augustine is admitting there might be long periods of time before the human race was created. But is that what Augustine means? If you read the context from about chapter 10 all the way through to, really, I just read through the whole end of the book, you realize that Augustine is talking about eternity, okay? And he pretty much explicitly says that eternity is timeless, okay? So the main issue he's saying here is the ages that passed before are eternal ages. They're timeless ages. So it's not time passing. It's an eternal age, okay? Now, why does he suggest this? Because he thinks time wasn't created until day 4, he has to explain what is being created on the first 3 days. And if time doesn't exist on the first 3 days, he has to say that these are timeless. This is a timeless state that everything is in, that creation is in on the first 3 days. And he thinks that angels were created somewhere in that progression. And he suggests sort of brainstorming, maybe the angels are what is meant by light being created on day 1. So he says the angels are created, and they're created in a timeless state. And this is an eternal age that the angels are living in, and it is in all time. And he makes it clear he's having trouble that anyone would have trying to describe a timeless state, because human language is difficult to use to describe a timeless state. In fact, this is one of the main objections to God being timeless. Is it leads to you have a hard time using human language to talk about it. That's another subject entirely. I think that Augustine is right about angels. I think angels are timeless, and God is timeless. But he talks about the ages that passed before, and there's another passage where he says a similar thing. He's like the eternal ages before this, but it means a timeless state. It doesn't mean time is passing. Okay? You have to interpret this in context and through the lens that Augustine was using. Okay? This is not a passing of time age. This is an eternal age. Okay? Augustine views the days of creation as a logical progression, not a temporal progression. Okay? And logically, if something is created ontologically prior, not temporally prior to the existence of time, it would be the angels, and they would have to be eternal during this time before, right? Time was created, and he recognizes the problem with saying the time before time, right? And he has this long discussion about this. And then he ends up in a weird place. Like, he has the correct argument about angels. He says, look, it doesn't matter that they're timeless. They're created by God, and their existence depends on God, so they're not co-eternal with the Trinity, right? The triune God. They're not equal to God because they're created. And it doesn't matter that they're timeless. But he suggests that maybe what if there is a time in which the angels were created, and that would separate them from the eternal God or the timeless God. And then he realizes that this is contradictory to his earlier suggestion that time was created on day 4 and angels were created on day 1. And so he ties himself up in a bunch of knots, and he appears to be suggesting an alternative where there's there's some kind of other timeless state that's not the same state as human beings are in. But it gets very confused, and Augustine himself ends up confused at the end of chapter 15. And he says, well, these issues are really too big for me. They're beyond my capacity, so I'm going to start talking about things I know about instead of this, okay? This would be an edit right here in the modern world, but back then you don't have word processing. So he just leaves it in there. But either way, this is not what he meant when he said, where are we here? When he meant, I do not know what ages passed before the human race, okay? Either he meant an eternal age, in which case time is not passing at all, or he meant another timeline that is not the same timeline that human beings are in. But I think that's very difficult to understand, and it's contradictory, and Augustine himself seems to recognize that. What he did not mean was that there is an actual long period of time passing between creation and the creation of human beings. That's not an old earth view, okay? And because Gavin and others look at this passage through the old earth lens, they see support for old earthism when it's not there. That's not what Augustine meant. Okay. So here's another quote from chapter 25 where he makes it clear that he's talking about timelessness as eternity. So he says, quote, before, I mean, in respect of eternity, not time. So before means logically prior, not temporally prior. It's not a time-based before. Okay? Continuing the quote, for what other creator could there be of time than he who created those things whose movements make time? And this is his argument that the movements that make time on day 4 means that time was created on day 4 when the movements make them. Okay? Here's another quote. Quote, as to those who are always asking why man was not created during these countless ages of the infinitely extended past. Let's read that again. Why man was not created during these countless ages of the infinitely extended past. I keep trying to say infinite. These countless ages of the infinitely extended past. And came into being so lately that according to Scripture, less than 6,000 years have elapsed since he began to be. Okay? These countless ages of the infinitely extended past are eternity, not a period of actual time passing. And Augustine makes that about as clear as he could, but old earthers are going to continue to misinterpret this through their lens. One last quote from Augustine at the very end of the book, chapter 27. He says, quote, since this book must be concluded, let us merely say that in this first man, who was created in the beginning? It goes on, but I'm ending there because this shows that Augustine did affirm that the first man was created in the beginning. He is not meaning long periods of time between creation and man. He's talking about eternal ages before the creation of time. Okay. So, Ortlund is doing apparently 2 more videos on the flood and the fall. I'm not going to respond to those. Most likely he's going to be rehashing the same sorts of criticisms that Hugh Ross has leveled against creationist views of the global flood for years and years, despite the fact that since at least 1994, the consensus flood model among well-studied young Earth creationists is catastrophic plate tectonics. Hugh Ross has not recognized the existence of catastrophic plate tectonics. As far as I know, in 1998, he wrote his first critique of young Earth creationism 4 years after the seminal multi-author study that signaled a consensus within young Earth creationism on the view. Hugh Ross has since republished the same book under a different title in 2014, I believe. Still does not talk about catastrophic plate tectonics. still levels outdated criticisms of creationist thought, young earth creationist thought on this issue. So in this video, Ortlund gave 2 solutions to the light time travel problem that virtually no well-studied young earthers accept today. Fails to mention the 2 sophisticated answers to the question that are in evidence today. And I would argue that one of those, Jason Lyle's anisotropic synchrony convention, is now the consensus view among, again, well-studied young earth creationists. But Gavin doesn't want to talk to well-studied young earth creationists because they'll refute everything he says. So it's left me with a question of why Gavin Ortlund is even addressing this issue. If he doesn't want to address the best scholarship from the other side, what is he doing? I don't know. So I'm not going to continue to respond to him. But the basic lesson here is that when old earth creationists read these ancient Christian texts, their background information forms a lens that distorts their interpretation, not just of Augustine and other ancient Christians, but the Bible as well. And that's the Hugh Ross effect.